So she cut the carbs and she ate a low-carb diet for all the years that she was being successful. And she won all these races, and so did Mark Allen. And the key to both of them was that they have these long careers. And both of them had low-carb diets.
That Triathlon Show, episode 44. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and I'm going to make this intro very short and sweet. You can hear more about today's interviewee and the intro to this interview series on last episode, episode 43, where we had part one of our interview with Professor Tim Noakes. And that was on the central governor model and how your brain really limits your performance by inducing perceived fatigue, and you really could, like, physiologically go a lot faster and longer than you think you could. But that's that interview. I encourage you to go back and listen to it. But today what we have on tap is part two, which is on low-carb, high-fat diets. And this is something, it has been a requested topic, and Professor Noakes is one of the most renowned experts in this field. So I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to discuss LCHF, low-carb, high-fat diets with him. We go into topics like the relation between high carbohydrate diets and diabetes, and how Tim ran the same times aged 61 as 41, if I remember correctly from our interview, when switching to a low-carb diet, and also things like Tim's take on ketogenic diets, which is kind of fashionable right now. So nothing more on my end for now. Enjoy the show. Let's move on to the second part of this interview and talk about nutrition and low-carb, high-fat in particular, as that is one of your areas of expertise. So again, fill us in on the background of how you got into that. You mentioned a bit of it already, how you wanted to rip out pages from the Lore of Running and rewrote it completely.
So what happened to me was that I had advocated this high carbohydrate diet for decades, for 33 years, in fact. And then one day I had just finished writing the book Waterlogged. And it was an emotional moment for me because the book, it meant a great deal. It was 30 years of opposition to many people, and I'd taken a lot of flack for writing the book. And I posted the final script to the editors in America, and I went to sleep, and then my brain in the middle of the night said, you will get up tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock and you will run 5 kilometers, and you'll run every day for the rest of your life. So I went out and had a run, and it was a terrible run. And when I came home, I was not feeling in great shape. I thought something's got to give, and I fortunately opened my emails, and there was an advert for a book called The New Atkins for the New You, written by Dr. Westman, Volek, and Finney. And they claimed that you could lose weight on this high-fat diet, the Atkins diet. And I said, well, we know that's false, because if you eat saturated fat, you're going to die of a heart attack. And Atkins had tried to kill us all, and here these people are linking their names to him. They must have sold out to him. But then I thought, but they're good good scientists. I knew of their work on high-fat diets. And Stephen Finney, I knew, was a first-class scientist. So I said, there's a paradox here. I must give them the benefit of the doubt. So I went and read the book, bought the book and read it. And within 2 hours, I said, oh, my gosh, I got it all wrong for 33 years. Because there I saw they listed 150 studies of low-carbohydrate diets and the health benefits, and the fact that your performance wasn't necessarily worsened on a high-fat diet. But you need to remember that in the 1970s, when I was running marathons, we would go on a high-fat diet for 3 days before the marathon. So it was 6 days before, 654 days, we would eat a high-fat diet, no carbohydrates, and we'd feel terrible. And then for the last 3-2-1 days before the race, we would load up on carbohydrates like it was going out of fashion. And then initially, I used to run well on that, but gradually it just got worse and worse. And in fact, it didn't seem to help my performance. And the reason was because I was insulin resistant. I was resistant to carbohydrates. So I was just stuffing myself with these carbohydrates, and they were making me sick. They weren't making me run any faster. So anyway, I went on the diet, and literally my running times went back from, I was 61 they went back to what they had been when I was 41. Not at the distances, but at the shorter distances of up to 10 Ks. I got back to what I was running as a 40-year-old, but I was 60. So all the impairment I'd had between 40 and 60, which I thought was because I was just getting old, was nonsense. It was because I was eating this bad diet, too much carbohydrate in someone who was pre-diabetic and then ultimately diabetic. And so then I started reading, and I've been reading solidly for the last 5 or 6 years. I've read hundreds of books and tens of thousands of articles. And it all makes sense that humans evolved as fat burners. We hunted animals for their fat, not for their protein. And we developed the desire, particularly for the countries in the north of Europe. We lived on mammoths. That's what we ate. And we chose specifically mammoths because they had so much fat on them, and they were such a reward when you kill these animals. So, because there was no carbohydrate, you can't grow carbohydrates in Finland. That's pretty obvious.
Or you couldn't, at least.
Yeah, you couldn't. You can now, but you couldn't then. So you had to eat these fatty animals. And the reason you ate the fatty animals is because humans have got a limit to how much protein they can consume. We can only provide 35 to 40% of our calories from protein, or else we die, because we don't have the liver and the kidneys to get rid of the byproducts of protein metabolism. So that was a great realization for me. And then I started getting reports back from other people who said they'd gone on the high-fat diet. And one of them was, this is the real paradox, was that I helped a lady called Paula Newby-Fraser, who's recognized as perhaps the greatest triathlete of all time. She's a South African who went to America when she realized she had a real talent, because she won her first triathlon, which was a short-distance triathlon, and she won it without training. So she said, gosh, I must have some ability. She won the right to go to Hawaii because she won that race, and she trained for like a month, and then she did really well. I think she might have come third or fourth in Hawaii in her first year. She then said, okay, listen, I've got a real chance. So she went to America, and she started training. In 1984, just when Steve Phinney published his first paper showing that a high-fat diet may help athletes in endurance sports. And she asked me, she said, Tim, what do you think about this high-fat diet? So I said, Paula, you should try it. And after she had won 28 Ironmans and 8 Hawaiian World Championships, when she retired, she came to see me in Cape Town, and she said, Tim, the best advice she ever received in her life was that advice, to eat a high-fat diet. But I said, Paula, I didn't tell you to cut the carbs. So she said, well, that's how I interpreted it. So she cut the carbs, and she ate a low-carb diet for all the years that she was being successful. And she won all these races, and so did Mark Allen. And the key to both of them was that they have these long careers. And both of them had low-carb diets. I think Paula was a lower carb than Mark Allen. But they're the two persons in the triathlon who had these long careers. And I think we now understand why. Because if you're eating all that carbohydrate, and especially the refined junk that people justify that they can eat because they're athletes, that harms you. It harms your health, and your body gets inflamed and you don't recover. And there might be all sorts of other complications. So I think in talking about high-fat diets, we focus rather too much on the acute effects in the laboratory. If you go on a high-fat diet for 3 weeks, do you improve your performance? That's actually not the question. The question is, what happens if you eat a high-fat diet for your career? Do you race more often? Do you have more successful races? Do you last longer? Do you have fewer injuries? Those are the questions that the athletes are finding out for themselves. And I think the evidence is coming through that the elite athletes are adopting this diet. And as we speak, the Tour de France is going on. And as we speak, Chris Froome is leading the race for the 4th time. And here's a guy who converted to a low-carb diet. He lost 8 kilograms and started to win races. And he's not gone back to a high-carbohydrate diet. It's very clear. He's as lean as he's been for the last 4 years on this low-carb diet. That doesn't mean he doesn't take carbohydrates on the big days like today, which they've got a big day in the mountains. He will have a big carbohydrate breakfast, and he probably had a lot of carbohydrate last night, and he will take carbohydrates during the race. But that doesn't mean on the other days when it's not as demanding, when it's on the flat stages, he's not going to load up on carbohydrates to the same extent. And particularly when in the off-season, he's not going to be touching the carbohydrates.
Yeah, you answered a lot of my follow-up questions already within that, in particular that longevity in your career. I should make it clear that I've been talking about this before as well, that I'm not necessarily a fan of low-carb diets, but those my lens or my viewpoint has been more kind of the acute performance and performing optimally in a high-intensity race, or even if it's a bit longer. But then again, if you look at that longevity, you definitely present excellent arguments about that. And so yeah, that was great to hear. One question about your running times that came to mind. Did you lose a lot of weight between the age of 41 and 61 when you were running those same times again on that high-fat diet?
That's a great question, because in my running, when I can answer it the reverse. So my intervention was within 6 weeks. When I'd lost about 6 kilos in the first 6 weeks, but I eventually lost 20 kilos. So I only lost a half or a quarter of the weight loss that I ultimately did. But all my running gains were achieved within 6 weeks, long before I lost all the weight. So it was independent of the weight. But you're quite right. I had put on a lot of weight. I put on 15 kilos perhaps in those 20 years. But I got my running back long before I lost all the weight.
Okay. But then again, losing weight is going to give you even more benefits. Of course, I think it's roughly 1% increase in running performance for percent body weight that you lose. That's something that Hans van Dijk in his book The Secrets of Running showed with some physics, and so it's roughly a 1-on-1 correlation there. So it's hugely important. And obviously in cycling as well, especially on those Tour de France stages, mountainous stages with a lot of hills.
Absolutely. And I mean, Chris Froome is the best example, because I don't know if you know his story, but he has a Cape Town connection. I'm from Cape Town, so it's really interesting. But when he came second in the Tour of Spain, he came home to Cape Town to meet his girlfriend, who is now his wife. And she said, "Gosh, Chris, what happened? You've lost all this weight." He said, "Well, I starved myself on the Tour of Spain, and I came second, and I lost 8 kilograms." So she said, "Well, you can't continue to starve. You've got to eat a high-protein diet." And that's what she said. But, of course, you can't eat a high-protein diet. She meant a high-fat diet. And then she advised him to continue on the diet, and she put him on a high-protein, high-fat diet, and because she had some nutritional training. So that's how he got it. But he couldn't win the Tour when he was 8 kilograms heavier, but he dropped the 8 kilos and he became the world's best cyclist. You're quite right. But just to make one other point, my performance happened between 4 and 6 weeks. Something happened in this adaptation. Suddenly, after 4 weeks, I suddenly started running much better. And within 2 weeks, I'd achieved a lot of that benefits. So in my case, there was a metabolic change that happened in my body. And maybe it was brain as well, but that the body changed, and then I lost a lot more weight, but my performance didn't change all that much thereafter. So yes, I agree absolutely. But I think for people like myself who are insulin resistant, that when you cut the carbohydrates, you get a huge metabolic advantage, even without the weight loss.
Yeah, would you say so? Who would you say that this is for? Is it for the everyday athlete, even if you're not necessarily in the risk zone for type 2 diabetes or insulin resistant?
You know, that's a great question, because firstly, if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, it's a nutrient poor diet. That's what we're not told. If your diet is based on grains and cereals, it's nutrient poor. And we've been fed this nonsense that it's high in vitamin B and all this rubbish. It's not. It's low in nutrients. High nutrient diets come from high-fat diets from animal produce. And that is, if you want to get a really nutritious diet, that's what you have to eat. I'll give you an example. One of the guys that I converted recently, and he's now the top Ironman triathlete in South Africa. He converted, and after 16 weeks, he did his best Ironman. He did 8 hours, and he ran a 2:47 marathon, which was 2 or 3 minutes faster than ever. And he'd adapted to the diet. And I asked him, "So tell me, what were you eating before?" And he showed me a list of what he was eating. It was rubbish. He was eating chocolates and sweets and Coke and chips. And I said, "But how can you expect your body to succeed on this diet. Oh, but it's carbohydrates. I said, no, it's nutrient poor, rubbish food. And as soon as he converted, as I've said, he improved. So I think that's the first problem, that the highly processed foods that we eat and we're encouraged to eat, and these goos and so on, that's not good food. And so everyone needs to get rid of them, regardless of whether you're insulin resistant or not. If you're insulin resistant, and let's make the point that the majority of people are insulin resistant, and the further north you come from, probably the more insulin resistant you are, because your predecessors lived on woolly mammoths, and they didn't get any.
Do you have any numbers? Do you know how many percent of the population roughly would be insulin resistant?
Well, I think you have to look at the population, and most populations are insulin resistant. See, what we're told is like the Catawans in the South Pacific. They eat a 70% carbohydrate diet, and they're profoundly insulin sensitive. But you go one island away to Australia, and you find the Australian Aborigines who also who didn't eat a high carbohydrate diet, who lived off the land, and they're profoundly insulin resistant. Or you take the Indians, the Plains Indians in North America, who lived on bison, they're profoundly insulin resistant. And as soon as you give them this rubbish diet, this processed industrial diet, they become obese, diabetic, and their health, within one generation, their health is utterly destroyed. Now, those are profoundly insulin-resistant populations. In North America, in California, they say 51% of the people are insulin-resistant. But They haven't even tested properly. They haven't even tested them properly because that's just because they've got diabetes or pre-diabetes. In my own town, they did a study of 1,000 people, and every single one of them is pre-diabetic or diabetic. Now, this is a particular population. It's the indigenous population, the so-called mixed race population. In this one study, 100% of those people are going to develop diabetes. And now that, again, it's an indigenous population, which would have come from populations that ate mainly animals, and now they've replaced it with this industrial diet. And that's when the insulin resistance and the diabetes develops. So it depends on the population. In the northern European countries, they're much less prone to get sick on this diet than other populations who've never seen grains for most of their evolutionary history. But it's 50-60%. And you see, the problem is you don't know that, like me. I mean, I was running all these races, and I know now that I was profoundly insulin resistant. But I didn't know it at the time because I didn't know what insulin resistance was. So my best advice is no one should know what their cholesterol, because cholesterol is utterly meaningless. But if you've got what's called your glycated hemoglobin value, that's your HbA1c, your glycated hemoglobin value. That tells you what your average glucose is during the day for the last 3 months. If your value is more than 5.5%, you're eating too much carbohydrate and you need to cut down, because you must be below 5.5 for optimum health. It's best to be 5, and if you were really athletic and optimal health, your value should be 5 or below. But 5.5 is fine. But if it's 5.6 and 5.7, you will develop diabetes. It's just a matter of time. And that value will continue to rise. So if your value is above 5.5, you are essentially diabetic in weight. You're a diabetic in waiting. And what's going to make your diabetes come on more quickly is eating a high carbohydrate diet, because the running or the triathlon is not going to prevent it happening. So, simple answer, tell everyone who's listening to this podcast to have the HbA1c value measured. If it's above 5.5, you're eating too much carbohydrate and you're going to get ill in due course. If it's below 5.5, continue with the diet that you're eating, because you're not currently at risk of developing diabetes. But once it goes above 5.5, it's time to increase your fat intake and reduce your carbs.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. And as usual, we'll have everything on the show notes so that the listeners, if you are driving or running or cycling right now, you can go to thattriathlonshow.com after the fact and and check those reference values and what it is you actually need to have a look at. That's great. That's completely new knowledge to me. I think also there's some fascinating new technology coming out that you can actually measure your blood glucose in almost real time these days with some interesting devices, and there are wearables coming out on the market that will do that. Do you know about this, and do you see any value in that potentially?
Yes, I do. And I know the one coming out from Apple, and I know Tim Wood, the CEO of Apple, has been wearing it for the last few months, and is clearly it's working, or else he wouldn't wear it and want it to be publicized. And they're obviously not targeting diabetics because it then becomes a medical device. They're using it for athletes. Now, the key argument is Tim Wood lost 20 pounds when he was using this. And why? Because he started noticing that when he ate carbohydrates, his glucose shot up through the roof. And he said, but that's not healthy. I know that I mustn't have a high glucose. So he's changed his diet, lost 20 pounds or 10 kilograms, and probably is a lot healthier for it because he could see what happens. And what people have to understand is that chronic ill health happens every time you spike your insulin and your glucose. And every time you eat carbohydrates, your insulin shoots up and the glucose shoots up at the same time. And you don't want that. The key to longevity is to keep your insulin and your glucose as low as possible. And you can't do that on a high carbohydrate diet. So people will finally get to see that goo or that high carbohydrate meal that they take in the morning of the race, or the high carbohydrate meal that they recover on, causes their blood glucose to skyrocket. And eventually they'll realize that actually that's not so healthy.
Yeah, I just interviewed Dan Plews, who you may know of, and he, together with Paul Larson, did some experiments that they may have documented somewhere. I'll see if I have a look and include that in the show notes as well, where they have been using some sort of wearables, probably not the Apple one. I don't remember which one, but they have some great insights on that as well, like a case study on themselves. I have one listener question I posted on my Facebook page for people to what questions they wanted to ask you, and one of my coached athletes actually asked about the benefits of maybe having like a preparation period, for example, the off-season, when you use LCHF or even ketosis to lose weight to get into your racing weight. What's your opinion on that?
Well, if you've got a weight problem, you're eating too much carbohydrates. So it's a simple solution. So, yeah, absolutely. If you've got weight problems, you see, what you have to understand is that you can't exercise to lose weight. You have to do 2 or 3.
What about if it's not a weight problem, but you just have to get to your optimal racing weight? You need to lose those 3 kilograms extra, which is not a weight problem necessarily, but it's those last few kilos that you need to lose. And then the second part of the question is, does ketosis have a part to play in this as well, or is an LCHF, a normal LCHF diet, enough? Okay,
so let me re-answer that question. It is a problem. If you weigh 3 kilograms heavier than you should be, then your diet's wrong. Your diet's a problem. You shouldn't have to be at the weight you don't want to be. And I think this is the problem because we talk about calories in, calories out. So people say, the only reason I'm 3 kilograms heavier is because I'm not doing that much exercise. No. You're eating more calories than you need because they're all carbohydrate calories and you don't need them. You're insulin resistant and you're not burning those carbs. So what's happening, you've increased your carbohydrate intake more than you need. You're hypersecreting insulin and you're storing the carbohydrate as fat and you're getting hungry. That's the key. See, obesity or weight gain is a problem of hunger. It's not a problem of not doing enough exercise. And we as exercise physiologists completely made that error. And industry wants us to continue making this error. Industry wants us to keep saying, guys, you can eat these refined carbs as long as you do your triathlon and train 2 hours a day. But the reality is you don't need to have that extra weight. It just tells us your diet's wrong and you must fix your diet first. So that athlete who's put on 3 kilograms during the rest period is eating too much carbohydrate. So absolutely cut the carbs and you'll find that the 3 kilograms will disappear and it won't be a problem. But then you'll begin to understand that this is not a calories in, calories out issue. It's an issue of hunger and insulin resistance and too much insulin.
All right, so we had some connection issues and we have now rescheduled, and we are recording this part of the interview, the last part, on a separate day where we lost the audio. And what we just talked about were about how to get to race weight, perhaps during the off-season, and you were talking about how LCHF in general is enough to get to race weight pretty easily. But then we were about to start discussing ketosis and if that has any additional benefits and what kind of role ketosis and ketogenic diets can play in this whole picture.
Well, indeed, there's some really good studies coming out of Oxford last year showing that if you ingest ketones, your performance seems to go up in short duration exercise. So I don't think one can discount that. I'm less sure that we really need to do it for the majority, though. I think it's a very expensive intervention, and I'm not sure that you could justify it for everyone. And also the other thing is that I think if you do take external ketones or you are ketogenic, the ketones might be acting in the brain as much as anything else. And so the performance benefits might be due to a brain effect. I just am not convinced that adding more fuel to the body during exercise is going to improve one's performance. However, there's also evidence that ketones do a lot of other things, that they enhance immune function and they may improve mitochondrial biogenesis and so on. So there's a huge amount of possibility that ketones could act in ways that we still don't understand. I have a huge respect for Steve Phinney and Jeff Volek, who've really been promoting the ketogenic diet for athletic performance. And neither of them is stupid. They are very, very clever people, and they wouldn't promote something that doesn't have really good evidence and for which there wouldn't be some biological explanation. So I think that we're still not there to understand the full role of a ketogenic diet for athletic performance. I think that one of the problems for many of us is it's very difficult to stay in intense ketosis. The dietary changes are quite tough. However, for example, you really have to eat a very low protein, high fat diet to be in ketosis all the time. And for many of us, that's pretty difficult. So I think that people need to experiment for themselves and see what happens if they're in ketosis and see if they really need to be in advanced ketosis and whether that has any additional benefits.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that clarification. And we were discussing off air as well. I just got in my inbox an email with the scholar alerts of the day, and there's a new study on ketogenic diet benefits body composition and well-being, but not performance, in a pilot case study of New Zealand endurance athletes. But I want to ask you to comment on that, since neither of us have read it properly. I have not done that either. I just browsed through the abstract, but we'll have a link to that as well in the show notes, because it can be interesting for people to get to know a little bit more about the latest research. That wraps it up for the general interview questions, but I still have 3 rapid-fire questions for you, starting with, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to nutrition, psychology, endurance sports, or anything like that?
Well, I got a couple, but I think the book Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes really set me up and made me realize that nutrition was not what I thought it was. That's a brilliant book. And then Nina Teicholz's Big Fat Surprise. I think those 2 books are absolutely astonishing if you want to understand nutrition for health. And then any of Jeff Volek's books on low-carb diets for health or for athletic performance. I think those would be the 3 books that you have to have on your shelf. You can't get anywhere without those 3.
And they will be linked up in the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com so that you can easily get access to those books. What's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
I think the physical activity, and I think particularly running ultra marathons. I started sport as rowing and became quite competent, and then decided I wanted to do an individual sport because rowing is a fabulous team sport. And I always wanted to run the South African Comrades Marathon, which is a 90-kilometer, 56-mile race. And it's very, very hilly. And 3 years before, I couldn't run 3 miles at the pace I eventually ran 56 miles. And that taught me that with effort and belief, you could do things you couldn't believe. And I think that really turned my life around, because then I I'd achieved something that I thought was utterly impossible. And from then I said, but actually, if you put your head to it and you work hard and you train hard, you can do things. So I think daily physical activity it keeps me healthy, but it was that achievement that made me realize that you can achieve things that you would never have believed possible.
And finally, what do you wish you had known or wish you had done differently at some point in your career? And I think that we already know the answer, so just sum it up quickly.
Yeah, no question. I wish I'd known about this diet when I was 15 or 16, because I was profoundly insulin resistant. I've got evidence back. We've got data on me. And I had a fasting insulin level which was 4 times normal at the age of 28 when I was running 140 kilometers a week and I was lean and running marathons and so on. But I was eating a high carbohydrate diet. And of course, no one knew what it meant. We just thought, well, you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, you must secrete more insulin. But we didn't realize that I was profoundly insulin resistant. And my running performances went down quite quickly after I adopted this very high carbohydrate diet. I put on weight and ultimately became type 2 diabetic. So I know if I had eaten this diet all my life, I wouldn't have type 2 diabetes, and my running would have lasted competitively a lot longer. And I just want to finish up with my great friend is a guy called Bruce Fordyce, as whom you know, and who won the Comrades Marathon 9 times. And I advised him to go on a high carbohydrate diet. And he won the Comrades Marathons. And of course, we all said, just because you're eating a high carbohydrate diet. Well, he became insulin resistant, put on weight, and changed his diet about 4 years ago. And his health and fitness improved dramatically. And he said, Tim, I wish I'd known about this diet when I was winning the Comrades, because I think I would have done even better.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you again for coming on a second time to finish up this interview. Finally, where do you suggest that people go and to find out more about you? And is there anything that you want to promote or plug?
Well, I'm obviously working quite hard on trying to promote this low carbohydrate diet globally. And we formed the Noakes Foundation from money we raised from the book, The Real Meal Revolution. And so at the moment, that's kind of where I'm putting a lot of my effort, is to help promote the idea that you can actually eat very well. Even the most poorest people can eat well. And that's a big focus. And we have a foundation website, the Noakes Foundation website. And we are about to start a network for promoting the teaching of this diet for doctors. So we're setting up a network to help doctors because, we think that although we criticize the medical profession, most doctors, the vast, vast majority, actually just want to help. But they have no idea because they've not been taught and they feel scared about prescribing this diet. And we really want to provide them with information. So that's a big focus in the next few months. But it's all on the Noakes Foundation website. And incidentally, 80 videos of the evidence that we gave in the trial, including Nina Teichholz and Zoe Harcom, who came to South Africa to be my expert witnesses. There are 80 video clips of the evidence that we provided during the trial. And it really does provide an introduction into low carbohydrate nutrition in a way that you won't find very easily on the web.
Perfect, and I will as well be linked up in the show notes. All right, folks, this has been Professor Tim Noakes. I really, really hope that you enjoyed this interview as much as I have enjoyed talking to you, Tim. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. It's been lovely to chat to you and to your listeners. Thank you so much for including me. It's been a great privilege, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you a lot for listening to this series of interviews with Professor Tim Noakes. And just to clarify a bit on my standpoint on today's interview and today's topic, because we have been talking about nutrition for triathletes before on this show, and also about LCHF diets. And I know that I have stated that I don't think that it's ideal for triathletes. And to give you some more context to that, I think that it's not ideal if you are trying to really produce that winning performance. You have everything perfectly laid out already. You have a good, healthy diet already. Then I don't think that performance-wise, LCHF diets are necessarily the best way to go. Although that being said, as Tim pointed out, there are a lot of great endurance athletes performing really great feats on low-carb diets, and it works for them. So there might not be just one solution. So who's to say that they're wrong, right? They are performing great endurance performances. People like Dave Scott and a lot of others have been doing that for a long time already. So at the end of the day, we're all an experiment of one, and also the benefit of LCHF might not be for optimal performance, in my opinion, but especially since a lot of the population in many Western countries these days are suffering from things like diabetes and insulin resistance, as Tim pointed out. Even getting your basic health right will be beneficial for your performance, and in that regard, that might be the role that LCHF diets has to play from a performance standpoint as well. If you're not already very healthy and eating a very healthy diet, because mind you, there are healthy carbs as well. Of course, everything depends on what your goal is, but I'm not talking about eating processed carbs and refined carbs and added sugars when we talk about high carbohydrate diets for triathlon. Of course, it's going to be high quality carbs in that case, but if you don't have that, if your standard diet, it might be in many cultures the standard diet consists of highly refined grains and added sugars and all those sorts of things, and in that case it might be difficult for you to actually know what makes good carbs, and maybe going on an LCHF diet makes it easier to stick to a healthy, nutritious, nutrient-dense diet, and then that might be a good thing from a performance standpoint as well. And of course, if you have insulin resistance, like many people actually have, then that might be something that you actually need to do from a health perspective. Anyway, just a couple of points that I wanted to make it clear from what my standpoint is as well. And mind you that when I talk about, and we have been talking about on interviews before, for example, with Ted Munson from Science in Sport and Kim Schwabenbauer and Jesse Kropelnicki, and that also depends on what kind of training you are, when we talked with Jesse. Anyway, when we talked about those high carbohydrate diets, sorry, it's getting late here, so I'm having trouble speaking, that my lens and the lens of many of my guests have usually been trying to really conjure up the optimal performance. And but I'll willingly admit that my lens is much, much, much more narrow than Professor Noakes, and Professor Noakes is much wiser and more accomplished than myself, and looks at a bigger perspective, definitely. So I think that this interview was extremely valuable, and I learned a heck of a lot. So again, thank you so much, Tim, for this interview. As always, for the listeners, you'll find the show notes for today's episode on thattriathlonshow.com. You can email me with questions and feedback to michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K. And if you found value in this interview, or you do find value in That Triathlon Show in general, it would be amazing if you could share it with your triathlon friends. I would be so grateful. So if you mind, do a little exercise with me. Grab your phone right now, open up Messenger, and text somebody that you recently chatted about triathlon with. Hey buddy, I thought you'd like to check out this amazing triathlon podcast called That Triathlon Show. You can find it on thattriathlonshow.com. Love you. Your name. And of course, you can replace your name with what your actual name is. But anyway, if you would do that, that would make my day. And especially if you email me to tell me you did it. On Monday, we'll talk about running injury prevention, running form, and rehab from running injuries, and all sorts of stuff with my good friend and an expert on the topic, James Dunn from the UK. And I've already done this interview and it was super useful. I'm already using some of the new stuff I learned, although I'm already very familiar with his teachings. But suffice it to say that you don't want to miss it. So until Monday, keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.